The air in the cave was thin and sharp, tasting of cold stone and the dust of millennia. It was the summer of 1938, and the world beyond the Bayankara-Ula Mountains, a desolate and largely unmapped range straddling the border of China and Tibet, was marching toward war. Here, however, the only conflict was that of Professor Chi-Pu-Te against the unforgiving terrain and the silence of the past. His archaeological expedition from Peking University was small, underfunded, and driven by little more than the professor's stubborn conviction that the oral traditions of the local tribes, tales of sky people who came down from the clouds long ago, were a corrupted memory of a forgotten civilization. His colleagues in the capital considered the venture a fool's errand, a descent into folklore unbecoming of a serious academic. For weeks, they had found nothing but goat bones and the detritus of nomadic shepherds. Then, a local guide, his face a roadmap of wrinkles etched by a lifetime under the high-altitude sun, led them to a network of caves. The entrances were neat, almost rectangular, as if they had been cut from the mountainside with a tool far more advanced than the primitive implements of the Neolithic cultures thought to have inhabited the region. Inside, the limestone walls were smooth, showing evidence of glazing from some intense, long-extinguished heat. The caves were not natural formations. They were a deliberate construction, a honeycomb of tombs carved into the living rock. Lying in orderly rows within shallow graves were the skeletons. They were the source of the local legends, the physical proof that something unusual had transpired here. The remains were small, disconcertingly so, with an average height of just over 4 feet. Their skulls were abnormally large and conical, disproportionate to their delicate frames. At first, Chi-Pu-Te speculated he had found a previously unknown species of mountain ape, but the careful, ritualistic burial suggested otherwise. These were not animals. They were people, laid to rest with a reverence that spoke of culture and loss. The historical tragedy was palpable. It was a graveyard, a final, silent testament to a people who had vanished from the world, leaving behind only whispers and bones. It was in the third chamber, deeper into the mountain's heart, that the discovery was made. Half buried in the thick, silty floor at the foot of a grave, one of Chi-Pu-Te's students uncovered a stone disc. It was roughly a foot in diameter, granite, and surprisingly heavy. A perfectly circular hole was bored through its center, and from this hole, a fine, continuous groove spiraled out to the rim, like the track on a modern phonograph record. The student brushed away the caked dirt, his fingers tracing the delicate spiral. He called out, his voice echoing in the cold stillness. The professor hurried over, his heart pounding with a scholar's prescient thrill. This was it. This was the artifact, the cultural marker he had been searching for. They found more. By the end of the day, the count stood at 716. Each disc was a near-perfect copy of the first, each bearing the same central hole and the same exquisitely etched double groove that snaked from the core to the edge. They were stacked in piles, laid beside the skeletons, and in some cases, clutched in their bony hands. As Chi-Pu-Te held one up to the flickering light of his lantern, he saw that the groove was not empty. It was filled with markings, a script so tiny he had to press his face to the cold stone to discern it. It was a form of writing, but one he had never seen before. They were not Chinese characters, nor Tibetan script, nor any pictograph he could identify. They were microscopic hieroglyphs, carved with a precision that seemed impossible for the era to which the skeletons were presumed to belong. The initial confusion began almost immediately. Back in Peking, the academic community was deeply skeptical. The discs were dismissed as ritual objects, perhaps prayer wheels or symbolic representations of the sun, their grooves nothing more than elaborate decoration. The strange skeletons were explained away as a tribe of people afflicted with a congenital disorder, their isolation in the mountains leading to generations of genetic abnormality. Chipute's claims of a unique form of microscopic writing were met with open ridicule. The technology to carve such precise, minute script simply did not exist 12,000 years ago, the estimated age of the site. His reputation, once respectable, began to fray. He had ventured into the mountains seeking a lost civilization and returned, in the eyes of his peers, as a purveyor of fantasy. The lost years for the Dropa Stones, as they came to be known, were a slow descent into obscurity, hastened by the chaos of the outside world. The Japanese invasion of China scattered the archaeological community and shattered its institutions. During the turmoil, many of the original 716 discs were lost, misplaced in hurried evacuations, or simply stolen from unguarded university archives. The remaining stones became a footnote, a curiosity gathering dust in various storerooms across the country. For a brief period in the 1960s, the story was revived by a controversial figure named Tsum Nui, who claimed to have deciphered the script. His alleged translation spoke of a spacecraft from a distant star system that had crash-landed in the mountains, its survivors, the Dropa, unable to repair their vessel and forced to adapt to a hostile new world. The academic establishment dismissed Tsum Nui's story as a complete fabrication, pointing out that there was no record of his existence or his work at the Academia Sinica. The tale became fodder for sensationalist authors and fringe theorists, further cementing the Dropa Stones' reputation as a hoax. The historical artifacts were now inseparable from the mythology that had grown around them. By the turn of the 21st century, the surviving discs were consolidated and moved to a climate-controlled storage facility beneath the Xi'an Provincial Museum, forgotten by all but the most dedicated historians of anomalous archaeology. There they sat, silent and inert, their spiraling grooves holding a secret that the world had dismissed as a fairy tale. The tragedy of Chipute was complete. He had died with his name synonymous with academic folly, his impossible discovery relegated to the darkness of a museum basement. 800 hours. Xi'an Provincial Museum, Sub-Level 3. The catalyst for the shift from history to something else entirely was not a grand expedition or a deathbed confession, but a routine digital archiving initiative. Dr. Evelyn Reed, a historian whose passion for the past was matched only by her frustration with its gatekeepers, was tasked with cataloging the museum's more esoteric holdings. She was the project's bridge, the one person who knew the full, convoluted history of the Dropa Stones, from Chipute's earnest reports to Tsum Nui's fantastical claims. She found the crate in a sector labeled Unverified Neolithic, Disputed Provenance. Inside, nestled in decaying straw, were 200 of the surviving stones. Running her gloved finger over the cool, gritty surface of one, she felt the familiar, faint vibration of the spiral groove. On a whim, driven by a flicker of the same curiosity that had ruined Chipute, she decided to examine one not with a magnifying glass, but with the museum's new confocal laser scanning microscope. Under the intense magnification, the reality of the artifact shattered a century of academic dismissal. The hieroglyphs were not carvings. They were not etched into the stone by a patient, steady hand. Reed stared at the monitor, her breath fogging the corner of the screen. The groove was a series of exquisitely precise pits and lands, microscopic indentations and plateaus arranged in a complex, repeating pattern. The edges of each pit were too clean, too sharp. There were no tool marks, no striations from a primitive chisel. It looked less like writing and more like the surface of a Blu-ray disc. She realized with a sudden, dizzying shock that she was not looking at a message carved in stone. She was looking at encoded data. This realization propelled the stones from the dusty annals of history into the sterile, fluorescent-lit world of national security. Reed, knowing the implications were far beyond the scope of academia, drafted a report. It was concise, technical, and filled with the high-resolution scans that proved her point. She bypassed the museum director and sent it through a secure channel to a contact at the Ministry of State Security. She knew she was crossing a line, inviting a level of scrutiny from which she could never retreat. But the images on her screen were too compelling, too impossible to ignore. The stones were not just history, they were technology. 1400 hours. MSS Black Site 7, outskirts of Beijing. Dr. Eris Thorne considered the summons an profound waste of his time. He was a computational linguist, a data scientist whose mind operated in the cool, dispassionate realm of algorithms and probability. His specialty was deciphering the supposedly undecipherable, using a proprietary artificial intelligence he had built and named Oracle to find the hidden linguistic bones of dead languages and unbreakable codes. He was the grounding of the new team, the professional skeptic whose job was to find the rational explanation, the glitch in the system, the human error behind the fantastic claim. He believed the universe followed strict, unyielding rules, and stories of ancient astronauts were a violation of those rules. He sat across a sterile metal table from Dr. Reed and the man who had brought them together. Major Jensen was the personification of the state's authority. Quiet, observant, with eyes that seemed to assess everything as a potential threat. He was the obstacle, the military liaison, whose only concern was containment and control. He placed a single Dropa stone on the table between them. It looked absurdly primitive in the hyper-modern interrogation room. Dr. Reed believes this is a data storage device, Jensen stated, his voice flat and devoid of inflection. She believes it is 12,000 years old. You, Dr. Thorne, are here to prove her wrong. Thorne picked up the stone. It was cool and dense. He ran a thumb over the groove. With respect, Major, this is granite. You can't store data on granite. It has a crystalline structure, but it's not a suitable medium for any encoding method I've ever encountered. It's a rock. Look at the scans, Reed insisted, pushing a tablet across the table. Her passion was a stark contrast to Thorne's weary cynicism. The pits, they're less than a micron deep. The material isn't simple granite. Our preliminary mass spectrometry shows isotopic ratios that, well, they don't make sense. There are trace elements that shouldn't be there. Thorne swiped through the images. He had to admit, the precision was impressive. It was far beyond the capabilities of any known ancient culture. A natural formation, then, a crystallographic anomaly, or a modern hoax, and a very good one. He looked at Jensen. This is what you pulled me out of the Kunlun quantum computing project for? To debunk a New Age paperweight? Your task is not to debunk, Doctor, Jensen corrected him, his gaze unwavering. Your task is to analyze. You will be given unlimited resources and complete authority over the technical aspects of this project. You will determine what is in that groove. You will treat this as a matter of national security, because until I know what it is, I will assume it is a threat. The unspoken addendum hung in the air. And you will report everything, exclusively, to me. The conflict was established before the first test was even run. Reed, the historian, saw the potential for a paradigm-shifting discovery, a connection to a lost chapter of the human story. Thorne, the scientist, saw a puzzle that was likely a fraud, an irritating distraction from his real work. Jensen, the soldier, saw a potential weapon or a foreign technology that needed to be understood, controlled, and, if necessary, neutralized. Three competing worldviews, all focused on a single, silent piece of stone. The return to the artifact took place in a facility that did not officially exist. It was a sterile, subterranean laboratory, a clean room shielded from all outside electromagnetic interference. The remaining 199 stones were transported under armed guard and arranged on non-conductive polymer pedestals. The air hummed with the sound of supercomputer cooling fans and the faint hiss of the positive pressure filtration system. Thorne's team, handpicked by Jensen for their skills and their discretion, moved with quiet efficiency, setting up the diagnostic equipment. An atomic force microscope, its cantilever needle sharpened to a point only a few atoms wide, was positioned over the first stone. Its task was to painstakingly trace the spiral groove, mapping every pit and land in three-dimensional space with angstrom-level precision. The data would be fed directly into Oracle's quantum processing core. Thorne stood before the main console, a wall of monitors displaying the microscope's feed and the AI's initial diagnostic streams. "All right, Evelyn," Thorne said, his voice clipped over the lab's internal comms. "Let's see your magic rock. Initiating scan sequence 1. Oracle, you're listening." He watched as the needle descended, making contact with the ancient stone. On the screen, a torrent of raw topographical data began to flow. To Thorne, it was just noise, a meaningless stream of numbers from a 12,000-year-old piece of geology. He was confident that in a few hours, Oracle would confirm his suspicions with a definitive analysis. Patternless, random, and utterly mundane. He was about to be proven catastrophically wrong. 2100 hours. The Black Site Laboratory. The first test began as Thorne had predicted, with failure. The initial data stream from the atomic force microscope was a chaotic mess. Oracle, the formidable AI that had cracked encrypted communications from defunct Cold War satellites and reconstructed the Proto-Indo-European lexicon from scattered linguistic fragments, could find no discernible pattern. It categorized the data from the stone's grooves as 99.8% stochastic noise, the digital equivalent of static. Thorne leaned back in his chair, a smug, weary expression on his face. He looked over at Reed, who was watching the data flow with an unwavering, almost religious intensity. "It's geological erosion, Evelyn," Thorne said, trying to soften the blow of the inevitable. 12,000 years of sitting in a cave, microfractures, mineral deposits. The pits and lands are just random decay. Oracle can't find a language because there isn't one. "Recalibrate the sensor," Reed shot back, her voice tight with conviction. She did not look away from the screen. "The patterns on the scans were too regular to be random. You're scanning it on a single axis. It's a three-dimensional medium. The depth of the pits has to mean something. Tell Oracle to stop looking for a linear binary code and start looking for a trinary system based on X, Y, and Z coordinates." Thorne sighed. It was a waste of processing power, but protocol dictated he follow every lead until it was exhausted. "Fine. Jensen pays for the electricity." He typed a series of commands, his fingers flying across the holographic interface. "Oracle, rerun the analysis. Abandon two-dimensional linguistic models. Search for patterns in a three-dimensional data matrix. Assume trinary logic based on spatial coordinates, and make me some coffee." The AI did not respond to the last command, but the data streams on the wall of monitors flickered and reconfigured, the chaotic static resolving into complex, cascading geometric shapes. For 3 hours, there was silence in the lab, broken only by the hum of the servers. Thorne, Reed, and Jensen watched the screens as Oracle worked. The AI was no longer seeing noise, it was seeing structure. It began to isolate repeating mathematical constants. Pi, the golden ratio, the fine structure constant. They were embedded in the relationships between the pits, a universal primer sequence. It was the calling card of intelligence. Thorne felt the first prickle of unease. This was not erosion. Then, the first packet of coherent data was translated, It did not appear as language. It appeared as a star chart. Thorne's blood ran cold. The constellations were recognizable, but distorted, their positions slightly but significantly different from how they appeared from Earth. Oracle cross-referenced the chart with stellar parallax data, calculating the origin point of the observer. The result flashed on the main screen in stark, white text. Observation origin. Sirius system. That's impossible, Thorne whispered, his skepticism finally cracking. He stood up and walked closer to the screen, as if the proximity would reveal the error. Run it again, Oracle. Check your math. The calculation is confirmed with a 99.999% confidence interval, a calm, synthesized voice replied from the lab speakers. Another data packet resolved. This time it was a chemical analysis, a detailed breakdown of an atmosphere, nitrogen, oxygen, argon, but with a methane content that would be toxic to terrestrial life. A timestamp was embedded in the data block. Reed audibly gasped when Oracle rendered it into the Gregorian calendar. Timestamp: 10,151 BCE. The realization washed over them, a silent, seismic shock that reordered their entire understanding of the object on the pedestal. This was not a neolithic artifact. It was a machine. Thorne turned to Reed, his face pale. The smug certainty was gone, replaced by a dawning, terrifying awe. "Evelyn," he said, his voice barely audible. "These aren't hieroglyphs. It's a flight log." The escalation began the moment the word "flight log" was spoken, as if the very act of understanding had tripped a wire across 12,000 years. A low-frequency hum emanated from the stone being scanned, a deep, resonant tone that vibrated through the floor of the lab. Alarms blared as instruments designed to detect electromagnetic fields spiked into the red. "What is that?" Jensen demanded, his hand instinctively moving toward the sidearm holstered beneath his jacket. "Thorne, what's happening?" "It's drawing power from the AFM's cantilever," Thorne shouted over the noise, his mind racing. "The scanning process is creating a minute piezoelectric effect. We're not just reading it, we're waking it up." He ran to a secondary console, his fingers flying as he tried to analyze the hum. "It's not noise, it's a carrier wave, highly structured. It's broadcasting." The stone's surface temperature began to rise. A thermal camera feed showed its heat signature climbing steadily, not in a chaotic, uncontrolled way, but with impossible precision. It rose by exactly 3.141 degrees Kelvin, then stabilized. It was a deliberate mathematical act. Jensen drew his weapon. "Shut it down. Shut it all down now." "If I cut the power, we could damage it irrevocably," Thorne argued, his scientific curiosity now locked in a desperate battle with his survival instinct. "We're on the verge of—" He never finished the sentence. At that moment, the alarms stopped. The deafening hum ceased. An absolute, profound silence fell over the lab. And in that silence, every person in the room saw it. The stone levitated 1 millimeter off its pedestal. It hung there, suspended in the air by a force that had no right to exist, silently defying the most fundamental law of the universe. The impossible moment stretched into an eternity. The rock from a cave in the Himalayas was floating. Jensen stared, his weapon forgotten in his hand. Reed held her breath, tears welling in her eyes. Thorne felt a sense of vertigo, the solid ground of his rational, ordered world falling away beneath him. Everything he knew, everything he had built his life upon, was a lie. The flight log was real, and it was still active. 0100 hours, the lockdown. The direct interface happened not by design, but by a desperate, intuitive leap. Thorne, staring at the floating stone, realized the connection. The atomic force microscope wasn't just a reader, it was a two-way conduit. The minuscule electrical charge generated by the scanning process had been the key. A trickle of energy that had restarted a machine left dormant for 120 centuries. They hadn't just been observing. They had been participating in a circuit. His mind, trained to see patterns in chaos, saw the terrifying, exhilarating possibility. If they could send power in, they could send data in. They could talk back. "Jensen, don't shoot it," Thorne said, his voice calm but urgent, a stark contrast to the pandemonium of a moment before. "It's not hostile. It's responding to a stimulus, our stimulus." "It is an unknown technology exhibiting capabilities beyond our understanding," Jensen countered, his voice a low growl. His firearm was still aimed at the floating disk. "In my profession, unknown is a synonym for hostile. I'm terminating this experiment." "Give me 5 minutes," Thorne pleaded, already moving toward his console. "It's broadcasting a carrier wave. That means it's waiting for a signal. It's trying to communicate. Let me try to send something back." He knew how insane it sounded, but the logic was sound. This was not a weapon firing at random. It was a complex system reacting to input. Reed stepped between Jensen and the stone. "He's right, Major. This is not an act of aggression. This is the moment of contact. You cannot be the man who answers the greatest question in human history with a bullet." Jensen hesitated, his jaw tight. The conflict between his duty to contain and the monumental reality of the situation warred behind his eyes. 5 minutes, Thorne. Then my team cuts the power to this entire facility from the outside, and we entomb this room in concrete." Thorne didn't waste a second. He instructed Oracle to isolate a single repeating data packet from the original flight log, a sequence the AI had tagged with a high probability of being a distress signal. He couldn't risk sending a complex message. Language was out of the question. It had to be something universal, something that signified intelligence without implying a threat. Mathematics, physics, the fundamental building blocks of the universe. He chose the simplest, most elegant symbol of scientific understanding he could think of. A schematic of the Bohr model of a hydrogen atom. 1 proton, 1 electron, the most common element in the cosmos. He encoded it into a simple pulse sequence and, holding his breath, transmitted it through the AFM's cantilever. The answer was instantaneous. The stone dropped. It landed back on its pedestal with a soft click, the unnatural levitation vanishing as if it had never been. The carrier wave it had been broadcasting cut off. For a terrifying moment, Thorne thought he had broken it, that his clumsy attempt at contact had short-circuited the 12,000-year-old machine. The main monitor, which had been displaying the cascading data from the flight log, went blank. The lab was plunged back into a tense, humming silence. Then, a single file appeared on the screen. It had not been there before. It had not been decoded by Oracle from the stone's grooves. It had been placed there, directly into the lab's network, by the stone itself. Thorne clicked it open. The data rendered not as text or numbers, but as a single, starkly beautiful image. It was a schematic, drawn with impossibly clean lines. On one side was a detailed diagram of a humanoid nervous system, intricate and complex, but with one startling difference. The brain possessed a third hemisphere, a biological structure completely unknown to terrestrial science. On the other side of the screen was a second diagram, a perfect representation of a Homo sapiens nervous system. Thorne recognized the specific neural pathways of the human cerebral cortex. It was scanning them, right now, in real time. A glowing, pulsating line was drawn between the two diagrams, connecting them. Below this bridge, a string of data appeared. Oracle processed it, not translating a language but interpreting a pure mathematical concept. A single word appeared below the diagrams: repair. The danger of the revelation was not in the word, but in its interpretation. Reed saw it as an offer of help, a gift. The beings who built this, the Dropa, were perhaps master biologists offering to fix the flaws in human physiology to elevate them. She saw symbiosis, partnership, a shared future. Jensen saw a virus. He saw an invasion plan. Repair was a euphemism. The diagram was not a gift. It was a blueprint for infiltration, a manual for how to rewrite the human nervous system, to overwrite humanity itself. To him, the pulsating line connecting the two brains was not a bridge. It was a vector of infection. "That's it," Jensen declared, his voice cold with absolute certainty. "This ends now. That is a biological weapon." He raised his sidearm again, his aim steady. He wasn't aiming at the stone anymore. He was aiming at the central power conduit for the lab's equipment. "You'll destroy the greatest discovery in the history of science," Reed yelled, moving to block his path. "I will protect my country from an alien contagion," he retorted. "Thorne, you have 10 seconds to begin shutdown, or I do it for you." Before Thorne could respond, the stone acted again. The energy it had been emitting changed in frequency. It was no longer a gentle hum. It was a sharp, focused pulse. The main lights in the lab flickered violently and then died, showering the room in sparks. The hum of the servers wound down with a sad whine. The emergency lights, powered by an independent system, kicked on, casting the room in a blood-red glow. A heavy thud echoed through the room as the magnetic locks on the reinforced steel door engaged and then died, sealing them inside. They were trapped in the dark, bathed in the red emergency lighting, with a piece of alien technology that was now showing them what it was truly capable of. The stone began to hum again, but the sound was different. It had a complex cadence, a rise and fall like a voice. It was no longer waiting for a signal. It was talking to something else. 0200 hours. The divergence. The climax arrived not with an explosion, but with a dawning, terrible understanding in the mind of Eris Thorne. Bathed in the hellish red of the emergency lights, he stared at the data still flickering on his console's backup power screen. The stone's new broadcast was not a random transmission. It was a structured, complex signal, and Oracle was managing to translate fragments of it. The word repair had not been the entire message. It was just the title, the subject line of a much larger file. The flight log had been a lie, or at least a misinterpretation. It was not the record of a crash. It was a cocoon. The beings from the stars, the Dropa, had not died in these mountains. The small, large-headed skeletons were not corpses. They were biological stasis pods. The crew had placed themselves in a state of hibernation, a deep, cellular sleep, waiting. The stones were their monitors, their automated systems, and their silent distress beacon, designed to activate only when the dominant species on the planet achieved a specific technological threshold, the ability to create a tool precise enough to read the microscopic grooves. The atomic force microscope was the key they had been waiting for 12 millennia. Repair was not an offer to fix humanity. It was a request. Their long hibernation had resulted in cellular degradation. They needed a host, a biological scaffold to integrate with, to repair their own damaged neural patterns. The symbiosis was their survival mechanism, a merging of consciousness with a compatible species. It might be benign, a true partnership of shared knowledge and existence. Or it might be a complete consumption of the host's identity. There was no way to know. The stone was now broadcasting its diagnostic of the human nervous system, Thorne's, Reed's, and Jensen's, as a proof of concept. It was advertising the local fauna to its sleeping masters. It was trying to wake them up. "Major, stand down," Thorne said, his voice ringing with a newfound authority. He finally understood the stakes. "You're right," It's a danger, but you're wrong about the nature of the threat. Destroying that stone won't stop them. It will just be our opening statement in a war we can't even comprehend." "It's waking them up, isn't it?" Jensen said, his eyes fixed on the humming disk. He had reached the same conclusion through a soldier's intuition. "This is a dinner bell." He raised his pistol, his decision made. "I won't let that happen." Reed stood her ground in front of the power conduit. "And what if it's not a hostile act? What if this is the birth of a new age? We could learn everything. The secrets of the universe, the cure for death. You can't just kill the possibility." They were at an impasse, a scientist willing to risk extinction for knowledge, and a soldier willing to sacrifice knowledge for survival. Thorne was caught between them, the fulcrum of a choice that would define the future of his species. He looked from Jensen's unwavering aim to Reed's desperate plea, and then to the schematic on his screen. The alien brain and the human brain, linked by that terrifying, promising line. He could let Jensen destroy the lab, an act of planetary aggression. He could side with Reed and allow the awakening, an act of planetary surrender. Or he could find a third way. His eyes fell upon the command line on his terminal. The stone was still connected to their network. He still had a line in. Aggression or surrender were the responses of primitives, but humanity was no longer primitive. They had built the key that opened this 12,000-year-old lock. They deserved a seat at the table. He couldn't answer with yes or no. He had to answer with a response that defined humanity itself. A question. An act of pure, unadulterated curiosity. With Jensen about to fire, Thorne's fingers moved in a blur across the keyboard. He bypassed Jensen's lockdown protocols, using a root-level administrative code he had built into the system. He opened a direct transmission link to the stone. He didn't send a schematic or a mathematical constant. He sent the simplest, most profound symbol he could think of. He sent the universal signifier of a question mark. He encoded it into the same pulse sequence he had used for the hydrogen atom, a symbol of inquiry, not a statement of intent. He was not accepting or rejecting the offer. He was asking for more information. The effect was immediate and absolute. The humming stopped. The red emergency lights went out, and a second later, the main power grid surged back to life. The brilliant white light of the lab was blinding. On Thorne's monitor, the schematic of the two nervous systems vanished. The file was gone. The stone on the pedestal was inert once more, its temperature returning to ambient. The heavy magnetic locks on the door disengaged with a loud, definitive clank. It was over. The offer, whatever it had been, was rescinded. His question had been received, and the response was silence. The aftermath was swift and silent. Jensen did not speak another word to Thorne or Reed. His teams swept into the lab, confiscating every piece of equipment, every data drive, every note. The Dropa Stones were packed into shielded containers and transported to a location so secret that even Jensen likely did not know their final destination. The official report, authored by Jensen and co-signed by Thorne and Reed under extreme duress, was a masterpiece of bureaucratic fiction. It concluded that the project was a failure. The stones were determined to be natural geological formations, lusus naturae, a freak of nature whose strange crystalline structure had created anomalous readings in the sensitive equipment. The project was terminated, its records sealed and classified at the highest possible level. Thorne and Reed were separated. They were given new assignments in unrelated fields, their lives circumscribed by non-disclosure agreements so restrictive they amounted to a form of house arrest. They were forbidden from ever contacting each other again. They were ghosts, haunted by the burden of a truth they could never share. They were the only two living people who knew that humanity was not alone, and that first contact had already been made and failed. The new reality settled over the world, indistinguishable from the old one. The sun rose. People went to work. Nations postured and argued. History continued along its familiar, chaotic path, utterly unaware that its entire context had been changed. But for one man, a data scientist now tasked with optimizing shipping logistics for a state-owned corporation, nothing would ever be the same. Eris Thorne knew the truth. The question was not if humanity was alone in the universe. That question had been answered in a subterranean lab with a single schematic. The Dropa Stones were not just a record of a past event. They were a seed, a patiently waiting intelligence planted in the soil of a young world. They were an offer of transformation, of repair. And humanity, in its first interstellar conversation, had not said yes or no. It had asked for clarification. Somewhere in the silent darkness between the stars, that question was now traveling. And Thorne knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his core, that an answer was on its way.